So next, let's run the correlations between this variable we're interested in, openness to interracial relationships, and several of the other variables from this data set. So we want to know specifically this openness to interracial relationship, how does that relate? How does that correlate with several of these other variables? So interethnic social experience, religiosity, family obligation values, family support for interracial relationships, and friend or peer support for interracial relationships. Luckily, JASP lets us run all of the correlations at the same time. So I have my JASP file here, and we're just going to follow the directions right here. So we want to go to regression, which is the fourth button over. Select correlation matrix, which is the first option. And then we want to move all of those variables that we said we're interested in to the right menu box. So that's where we want the variables to go. So we'll start with openness to interracial. And I am going to, okay, so that's there, openness. Then interethnic social experience, religiosity, family obligation values, family support for interracial, and friend peer support. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's all of our variables. So we move them to the right. Then it also helps if you check the box next to where it says flag significant correlations. So if you click that, so you can notice, let's go ahead and make this bigger now so we can see. So here is our correlation matrix. It's a matrix because it's plotting a bunch of different kind of things against each other here. So you can see if you unflag for significant correlations, those little asterisks disappear. So if we flag it, that just helps to highlight which of these relationships are what we would call significant. And remember, thinking about significantly weird and what does all that mean. Okay, so here is our correlation matrix. I will save a copy of this output and post it so that you can refer to it directly. Here is our correlation matrix. And we can see that here we have openness to interrelation, interethnic, social, religiosity. So we have our variables listed both down the rows and the same thing across the columns. So this is saying, so you'll notice where openness and openness connect, there's nothing there, right? But where openness and interethnic social connect, we see two values. So the top value, Pearson's R, that is that R correlation value. That tells us, is this weak, medium, or strong? This tells us about the strength of the relationship. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that on the next page. The p-value is what we read to determine whether this is significantly weird or not. Is it so weird that we think that we toss out the null hypothesis and say, yeah, it looks like there is a relationship between how much time you spend socializing with people of diverse backgrounds and how open you are to dating people of other racial groups from yourself, right? Sorry, that was a very convoluted way of saying that, but that there is a relationship here. So that's what that p-value tells us. Is it so weird that we see this strong of a relationship that we chuck out the null hypothesis and say there is a relationship? So two separate things. The top number, Pearson's R, gives us the strength. Is it weak, moderate, or strong? P-value tells us, is it significant or not? And if you flag for significant, then it'll put the little asterisks, which helps make it a little more obvious which ones are significant. So again, let's just kind of practice reading another. So family obligation values, these top two numbers correspond to the relationship between that and family support for interracial relationships. And these bottom two numbers are the R and the P value between this variable and this variable, friend support. Okay, so you want to look at where they cross each other in the matrix and just read across the rows to determine, is this talking about the strength or is it talking about the significance? Because those are two separate concepts that are definitely related to each other, but we want to make sure that we're talking about each of those things separately and not confusing them. So what I'd like you to do here is using that output that I'll post, um, I want you to look at the Pearson's R value, the top row of each of those combinations. And I want you to look at those R values and think about these guidelines for determining, is that R value so low that it's almost zero, that it basically is saying there's no relationship between those variables. If the R value you see is between 0.1 to 0.29, that would imply a small relationship. Medium is for 0.3 to 0.49, and large is from 0.5 to 1.0. So keep in mind, R values can only vary from -1 to +1. Right? So in each of these cases, I also want you to think about this also means the negative to the negative version, right? So all of these we could just put a negative in front of as well. So it doesn't matter if it's negative or positive, we're just looking at the value. The value of R tells us the strength. The sign, whether it's positive or negative, tells us, is it going that way or is it going that way? The p-value tells us, is this a strong enough relationship that we think, that we believe in the population, that there likely is a relationship there, that it's not just a fluke in the numbers. Okay, so what I'd like you to do on this one is to look back at these R values and determine which ones, and here I'm really only specifying with openness to interracial relationships. So what that means is I really only want you focus on this first column only, right? So just openness to interracial relationships with the others, not all the rest of them. Okay, because really that's the variable that we're particularly interested in right now. Okay, so look at those and determine like this 0.515. So that represents the relationship between openness and interethnic social. So this 0.515R, we would look here, okay, if it's 0.515, where does that fall in terms of these values? So the 0.515 would actually be in this one, right? Because it's above 0.5. It's between 0.5 and 1. So here we could say this relationship, openness to interracial relationships with interethnic social. And then you may even want to indicate on here, what is that R value and what is that P value? Because that might come in handy a little later when you're writing things up. It's not strictly necessary. Once you've categorized them based on those R values, then you want to switch to looking at the P values and determine which of those correlations, again in this first column, which ones of these are significant. This is where the asterisk helps. What I really want you to think about is, what does that mean? So think back to your notes from the videos. I will write up my responses to these and then you can compare with mine. And just think about conceptually, what does it mean if it's significant? Then, based on the correlations you see, I want you to tell me about the relationship that you maybe see between the strength of the correlation and whether it's significant or not. So look back and compare your answers on 7 and 8. Is there some sort of relationship between those that are significant and where they fall in our strength table? For number 10, I want you to refer back to your guided notes 10C, I think, the correlation by hand, and follow those steps for writing out the 5 steps. Again, I'll do the same and you can compare with me. Do your best to provide an interpretation. What do you think the p-value means from our from this particular, right? So looking at these two particular variables, and you'll have that information in the output. And then thinking about, based on the results, can we conclude that family support causes something else, right? So again, I just want you critically thinking here, putting down your ideas, and then we'll reconnect and clarify, and you can check against my answers. This last part, number 13, this is optional for those of you who want to do the extra practice. You can type this up and submit it along with your comments for this week. So really here, this is, again, we're going to be practicing APA style, which is a common way of reporting statistical results in the social sciences. So this little chunk right here represents a report of a correlation analysis. This analysis attempted to examine whether students' grades in their spelling and math classes were related. So we can see what the two variables are, their spelling and math scores. Student grades in spelling class and math class were moderately, that's the strength, positively, is it going up or down, correlated. We see here, this is where it starts to get really technical. This is where you're working on the technical APA formatting. And so there's more description of this, but this 55 is our degrees of freedom. And I'm just realizing, you can hear me thinking right now that we don't get that in this output from JASP. So I would say go ahead, for the time being, we'll just say R equals. That's also a common way of writing it. Some people don't put the parentheses, so R equals. Then this R value is what the R equals. The P is what the P equals, right? Both of those will come from this output, R and P. You plug them in and you follow this, and to get a little practice writing up in that style, again, number 13 is optional. And I will finish writing up my answers, and then we'll post these in another day or two so you can compare with yours. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.